The townhouse at 4 Cadogan Lane Street oohed quietly against the soft June drizzle of London. Its walls bore no hint of the tragedy they would soon contain. Behind the closed doors, Judy Garland's star, icon, child woman whose voice had once lifted millions, slipped into her final night. At 47, she carried the weight of decades that had stretched her thin, years of relentless demand, pressing upon fragile bones. On the bedside table lay remnants of ordinary life. Half-folded papers, an untouched glass of water, a pair of shoes abandoned near the door. And in the bathroom cabinet, the bottles, sleeping pills, barbiturates lined like silent sentries in the dark. It was not unusual. Such companions had followed her for decades. Yet this time, the balance tipped irrevocably. The official record would state an accidental overdose. But as dawn came and her new husband found her motionless, the room itself seemed to resist such simple closure. The air was too still, the details too precise. Judy had sung of rainbows and dreams beyond the ordinary, but her ending was small, hidden, almost domestic, an abrupt silence after a lifetime of sound. Her body was discovered, sprawled upon the bathroom floor, bare feet against the cold tiles. There were no notes, no grand gestures of farewell, just an extinguished light found in the stillness of early morning. The coroner would later insist it was not suicide, that the dose was cumulative, slow, inevitable. But inevitability can feel like design when the path has been laid stone by stone for decades. What makes the moment uncanny is not only the end itself, but the echo of her voice that remained. Only days before, she had sung in small venues across Europe, audiences still roaring at her resilience, still clinging to the myth of the girl who once believed in Oz. That applause had followed her here, to this quiet London street, lingering like a ghost at the windows. Mirrors in the bedroom reflected her last living hours. To those who saw her then, she was both radiant and frail eyes, still capable of flashing with wit, body worn to fragility. Mirrors had always been cruel to Judy. They revealed not only her face, but the machinery of control that had sculpted her into the eternal girl with ruby slippers. On that final night, the mirror bore silent witness, showing only what the living could not yet accept. The time had run out. Clocks ticked in the silence, each second a reminder of the narrowing span. They marked not only her final hours, but a lifetime of borrowed time pushed beyond natural rhythms by stimulants, sedatives, diets, and deadlines. The clock had been rewound too many times. Now it had stopped. To die at 47 was a tragedy. To die after surviving so much, after escaping ruin again and again, gave the event a strange sense of unfinished theater. Judy Garland's life had always played out, as if on stage, with audiences gasping at her collapses, applauding her comebacks. But this final act unfolded without an audience, without applause. It was too quiet, too hidden, too sudden. The newspapers would rush to print, weaving their own scripts of her demise. Headlines spoke of overdose, of heartbreak, of the fallen star. Yet between the lines lay something harder to name. The sense that Judy Garland had been undone, not by one night, but by a lifetime of shadows cast long before that June morning. Her death was less an ending than a culmination, a mosaic of choices made for her, and by her, of love and betrayal, of pills and promises. She had been told to sing, to smile, to keep going, until she could not. And in that small London townhouse, the echoes of a voice that once promised hope and wonder faded into silence. In the stillness of that dawn, Judy Garland's story did not close. It fractured, multiplied, became legend and mystery. For the question that would linger was not only how she died, but how a woman whose voice defined dreams could be left so alone, silenced in the dark. Long before the townhouse in London, before the pills and the whispered headlines, Judy Garland was a child with a voice that seemed to pour out of her like light through stained glass. Born Frances Ethel Gumm in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, she was only 2 when she first stepped onto a stage. Her parents, both performers, dressed her in tiny costumes, her hair curled, her smile rehearsed. She was too young to understand the applause, but old enough to feel the heat of expectation. On those small-town stages, Judy was already being trained for something larger, though she could not yet see it. Her sisters flanked her in the act, but it was Judy's voice clear, uncanny, too powerful for a child that drew every gaze. A neighbor once remarked that when little Frances sang, it was as though she was pleading for something, though you could not say what. The Gumm family moved often, chasing opportunity, until California pulled them westward. By then, Judy was the beating heart of their act. In vaudeville theaters across the country, the Gumm sisters performed, but it was Judy who drew gasps. Her mother, Ethel, was the driving force, a woman determined to carve success from her daughter's small frame. She became Judy's first shadow, urging, managing, demanding. Even as a child, Judy began to learn the sharp edge of love when it is tied to ambition. Hollywood found her when she was only 13. MGM signed her not because she was beautiful. Studio executives fretted she wasn't glamorous enough, but because her voice seemed impossible, older than her years. She was neither child nor woman, caught in a liminal space that would haunt her life. One producer cruelly called her the Little Hunchback for her slight curvature of spine. Others measured her waist, scolded her for being too short, too ordinary. They gave her new teeth, corsets, and a name, Judy Garland. From the beginning, Judy was told she was never quite enough, not pretty enough, not thin enough, not obedient enough. Yet, her voice, that singular gift, made her indispensable. To MGM, she was property, a precious resource to be protected, exploited, reshaped at will. Pills soon appeared in her routine. Tablets to wake her, to slim her, to sleep. A child's body, forced into an adult schedule, could not endure without chemical correction. And so, the rhythm of dependence began. The irony was cruel. The studios prized Judy's innocence on screen but destroyed it off stage. She was kept under watch, denied the ordinary life of a teenager, guarded as if she belonged to the world rather than herself. She wanted to laugh, to go on dates, to eat freely, but these simple desires were met with the cold arithmetic of profit. Every pound she gained was calculated against box office receipts. Every glance at a boy was a headline risk. Even then, Judy seemed to know her life was not her own. Friends recalled that she would often stand before mirrors backstage, staring at herself as if trying to find the girl behind the makeup. Sometimes she whispered, "Do you think they'll ever let me grow up?" That question lingered, unspoken, throughout her youth. For Judy, the studio was both sanctuary and prison. It gave her the world, yet took her childhood. By 15, she was working 18-hour days, carrying the weight of musicals that became classics. Broadway Melody of 1938, Love Finds Andy Hardy. Each performance made her indispensable, but each step deeper into the machinery stripped away a piece of the girl who once sang in small-town theaters. One eerie symbol remained constant: the shoes. From her earliest days, Judy was fitted with shoes to match the roles assigned to her. Ballet flats, sequined pumps, and most famously, the ruby slippers. They were always too tight, designed for appearance rather than comfort. In photographs, she often smiled, but her feet were blistered, her toes cramped. The shoes became a quiet metaphor for her life. Dazzling on the outside, unbearable within. The world adored Judy Garland. The studios sold her image as bright, innocent, unshakable. But behind the glassy eyes of the posters, there was a child whose ownership was never hers. A child who was told to sing louder, smile brighter, weigh less, and never stop. And so the stage lights grew hotter, the shadows longer. In this second act of her life, the seed of mystery was already planted. For how could a girl so radiant in public feel so erased in private? How long could a child survive when even her name, her body, her very image no longer belonged to her? In the labyrinth of MGM's sound stages, the mirrors were everywhere. Dressing rooms lined with glowing bulbs, powder rooms where makeup artists fussed, corridors where Judy would pause, always caught by her own reflection. For the public, Judy Garland was the picture of rising stardom, bright-eyed, sweet-voiced, destined for glory. Yet behind the mirror, another figure watched her with quiet despair. The girl who could not meet the world's gaze without first erasing herself. Even as her fame grew, Judy's insecurities deepened. Studio executives reinforced them daily. She was too short, too round, too ordinary. "The fat one producer whispered, knowing she could hear. Diets became punishments, days of hunger followed by days of pills. If she faltered, the reflection in the mirror accused her. If she obeyed, the reflection seemed hollow, drained of warmth. The mirror became a silent adversary, showing her not who she was, but who the world demanded her to be. Photographers captured her smile with precision. Publicists tailored interviews that made her appear wholesome, radiant, untouchable. And yet, when the cameras left, Judy often collapsed into herself, saying she felt like a fraud. A friend once recalled finding her backstage, staring into a mirror as though it held secrets. "Sometimes," Judy admitted softly, "I don't know which one is me, the girl in here or the one out there." Her public persona was a mask, one painted with the brush strokes of fantasy. The real Judy Francis Gum, the girl from Minnesota, was receding. In her place stood a figure who belonged more to Hollywood than to herself. But even as she struggled, her voice remained unbroken, pouring from her throat with astonishing clarity. It was as if her soul had chosen sound as its only true outlet, while the rest of her was carefully dismantled. By the late 1932nd, Judy's fame had become unstoppable. Audiences adored her sincerity, that rare quality that made her seem both star and neighbor, fantasy and girl next door. Yet those same qualities were the ones most exploited. The more authentic she appeared, the less she was allowed authenticity in her real life. The contradiction was suffocating. A girl celebrated for her honesty, who was forced to live inside a lie. It was during this time that Judy began to associate the mirror with judgment. Her diaries mention nights spent staring into glass surfaces, her mood spiraling as she inspected every flaw. Sometimes she covered the mirrors in her dressing room, unable to bear their reflection. Other times she leaned into them, as though searching for the girl who once sang joyfully without fear of ridicule. There is something tragic about a life where the self becomes fragmented between surfaces. For Judy, identity was a performance, and performances became identity. The psychological toll was immense. By her late teens, her laughter often carried an edge of panic. Friends noted how she oscillated between joy and despair with alarming speed. The mirror revealed these shifts before anyone else could. Still, the world applauded. Judy Garland was now a star. Yet she was also a mystery to herself, trapped in the paradox of being both adored and invisible. Every reflection, every photograph, every glowing magazine cover asked the same question: who are you really? The motif of the mirror haunts Judy's story because it is where her two lives collided. The public saw radiance. She saw fractures. The industry saw profit. She saw erasure. The child who once sang freely was now barely visible, hidden behind powder and shadow. In later years, she confessed to a confidant, "They wanted Dorothy. They wanted that little girl. But she was never me. She was never real." And yet, The mirror demanded Dorothy daily. The tragedy of Judy Garland in these years is not only in what was taken from her, but in what she was never allowed to discover. The unfiltered, unmediated self behind the glass. Each time she sang, that self flickered through, pure and unguarded. But when the applause faded, she was left again with her reflection, with the girl in the mirror waiting, questioning, unreachable. When The Wizard of Oz premiered in 1939, the world fell in love with Dorothy Gale, the small girl in gingham, ruby slippers sparkling beneath studio lights, her voice carrying "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" into eternity. Judy Garland was 16, too young to grasp the permanence of what she had given to the screen, yet old enough to feel the weight of the image that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Dorothy was the dreamer, the innocent, the girl who believed in magic. Judy was flesh and blood, already carrying scars. The curse was simple. The world refused to see the difference. The film itself was a marvel of Hollywood machinery, but its creation bore the familiar cruelty Judy already knew. MGM wanted her slimmer, brighter, eternally childlike. They wrapped her chest to keep her body from maturing on camera. They fed her a regimented mix of stimulants to keep her awake during long days, and barbiturates to force sleep at night. A teenager's natural rhythms were considered irrelevant when pitted against the rhythms of box office demand. Every frame of Dorothy, the laughter, the tears, the pure voice reaching for a world beyond rainbows was etched from Judy's own exhaustion and longing. Yet the image created was not hers to control. It became a symbol, frozen in time, a promise of innocence that Judy would never again be able to live up to. She could not age without disappointing someone, could not stumble without shattering illusions. The curse lay in the slipper itself, the glittering artifact that fans and historians would one day guard in glass cases, revering them as if they carried magic. To Judy, those shoes were instruments of confinement. She wore them too tightly during filming, her feet aching, the sequins cutting into her skin. Long after, she confessed to friends that the ruby slippers had become a private emblem of pain, a reminder that her body and her childhood had been refitted for fantasy. When the camera stopped, Judy was not Dorothy. She was a girl desperate for sleep, desperate to be unseen, desperate for release from the role that had already eclipsed her. Yet everywhere she went, audiences greeted her as if Dorothy had stepped from the screen. Strangers called her by the name, not understanding they were praising a mask, not the girl. Hollywood has a way of binding stars to a single myth. For Judy, The Wizard of Oz became both her crown and her chain. The more audiences adored Dorothy, the more Judy vanished. Executives built her career on trying to replicate the miracle sequels, musicals, bright sets where she was made to smile even as her health frayed. Behind the Technicolor dream, she was crumbling. There is something eerily symbolic in how Dorothy's journey in Oz was always about escape, finding her way back home. Judy, too, longed for home, for a place untouched by contracts, pills, and cameras. But unlike Dorothy, no tapping of shoes could undo her reality. Hollywood had given her a role so indelible it erased the girl beneath it. The wizard's curse was not a spell, but a story that refused to end. Audiences demanded that Judy forever remain the young girl skipping down the yellow brick road. Even as her body aged, her voice deepened, and her spirit longed for something more honest. Each time she sang "Over the Rainbow" on stage in later years, the applause carried both adoration and cruelty. Adoration for the song, cruelty for the demand that she resurrect innocence again and again. The film immortalized Judy Garland. It also imprisoned her. Her death decades later would be marked not by her last performance, but by the shadow of Dorothy Gale, the girl who found her way home, while Judy never quite did. By the 1942nd, Judy Garland was no longer just a girl with a luminous voice. She was the keystone of MGM's empire. Every picture they put her in turned to gold. Every smile promised millions at the box office. But behind the musicals and the glamour, a more sinister theater was unfolding. One built not on applause, but on pills and promises. The pattern had begun when she was a teenager, but by her early 20s it was ritual. The studio supplied her with pep pills to keep her awake through 18-hour shooting days, and barbiturates to force her down when her body refused to sleep. In between came the diet tablets, the powders, the tonics. Each dose came with reassurance. This will help you get through the day, Judy, just until the shoot is over. But the shoots never ended. The demands never ceased. The promises blurred into lies. Her mother, Ethel, often played her part in this machinery. Friends later recalled how Judy was handed pills even at home, as if medication were no different from a meal. It was a cycle Judy could not escape, controlled by those who claimed to love her most, yet who saw her more as an investment than a daughter. The paradox was cruel. The more fragile she became, the more tightly they bound her to the wheel. There were nights when Judy stood on set, her eyes glassy from exhaustion, her body trembling, yet her voice rising like a cathedral bell. Co-stars spoke of her uncanny ability to summon perfection at the brink of collapse. She was a miracle, one director said, but a miracle we used up. Each performance, each radiant smile, was pulled from the marrow of her being. She began to mistrust time itself. Hours blurred together in a haze of rehearsals and sleep forced upon her. Days felt stolen. Clocks became meaningless objects ticking in the background, reminding her only of what she had lost control over her own rhythms. It was as if she lived in perpetual twilight, never fully awake, never fully at rest. By her early 20s, Judy's dependence was no longer a studio secret but a whispered truth among those who worked with her. Yet the system did not loosen its grip, it tightened. Executives promised her breaks, vacations, time away. But when box office numbers called, she was summoned back, always with the same vow. Just one more picture, Judy, then we'll let you rest. The promises were never kept. Each time she resisted, the studio reminded her of contracts, debts, obligations. They spoke of her as irreplaceable, yet treated her as disposable. And Judy, raised in this machinery since childhood, knew no language but compliance. Her body carried the scars. Weight fluctuations, exhaustion, breakdowns each became fodder for gossip columns. Reporters snapped photographs of her looking frail, unkempt, a shadow of Dorothy. Headlines speculated on her instability. Yet no one spoke of the factory that had engineered this unraveling, the system that had taught a child to rely on chemicals instead of care. One haunting image from this era remains. Judy, sitting in her dressing room, a cluster of pill bottles arranged beside her mirror like tiny soldiers. She would take one, then another, chasing balance she could never quite reach. The mirror, once again, reflected the contradiction. The radiant star being prepared for another scene, and the exhausted woman behind the facade, barely holding together. Philosophers often argue that the greatest cruelty is to be treated as a means rather than an end. Judy Garland lived this cruelty daily. Her body was a means to musicals, her voice a means to revenue, her image a means to fantasy. The human at the center was rarely acknowledged, except when she faltered, and even then, only as a problem to be managed. The theater of pills and promises became her true stage, the performance unseen by audiences yet more central than any film role. It was the hidden script of her life, an endless cycle of chemical highs and engineered lows, a play that had no curtain call. By the time she realized she was trapped, the walls had already closed in, and yet, even in this state, Judy could still walk onto a stage, open her mouth, and sing with such force that strangers wept. That was the paradox. The world clung to the fragile woman whose voice sounded immortal. It was both miracle and torment, a cruel reminder that brilliance often burns brightest against the darkest backdrop. There was always something uncanny about Judy Garland's voice. It wasn't merely powerful, it was unguarded, raw, as though it had traveled through sorrow before reaching the listener. Musicians described it as an instrument of contradictions, supple yet jagged, warm yet edged with ache. When Judy sang, she was no longer the fragile body on stage, or the exhausted woman in the dressing room. She became something elemental, a sound that could crack the air like lightning, or so legend said shatter glass. In the 1942nd, her voice was MGM's most precious asset. Producers spoke of it with awe, but also with calculation. They could measure its resonance in ticket sales, its range in the balance sheets. Yet what could not be measured was the intimacy it forged with audiences. People felt she was singing to them, not at them. In darkened theaters, strangers leaned forward, believing they were glimpsing the truth of Judy's soul. But the truth was more complex. Judy often confessed that she felt stripped bare when she sang. The notes revealed everything she tried to hide: the loneliness, the hunger, the fatigue. For her, music was not escape but exposure. Each song was a confession masked as entertainment. Each ovation was a reminder that her pain had been made public, consumed as spectacle. On stage, she seemed invincible. Off stage, her voice was fragile. Doctors warned that years of overwork, combined with lack of rest and endless smoking, strained her vocal cords. Some nights, she rasped through rehearsals, convinced the sound would fail her. Yet when the spotlight found her, the voice returned, almost miraculous, like a river surging after drought. Colleagues whispered that she willed it into being, bending her body against its own exhaustion. The motif of the microphone became central in her life. That gleaming silver object, standing sentinel before her, was both salvation and burden. Into it, she poured her essence, shaping vibrations that reached across continents. Yet the microphone also recorded her decline, capturing the tremors, the cracks, the faltering breaths. It was merciless, storing every vulnerability in sound. Audiences often recalled a peculiar electricity in Judy's performances, a sense that the concert might collapse at any moment. Would she make it through the song? Would she stumble? That tension made the applause thunderous when she triumphed. People said they felt complicit in her survival, as though their belief willed her through each refrain. Judy knew this too, and it both sustained and haunted her. The knowledge that her suffering had become a kind of theater the public could not look away from. In psychology, there is a concept of the wounded healer, the one whose suffering enables them to offer solace to others. Judy embodied this paradox. Her voice carried wounds, but those wounds made her songs transcendent. She sang the truth, one critic wrote. But the truth she sang was one that consumed her. There is a chilling detail in how audiences described her live shows in the 1952nd. They said it felt like listening to someone on the brink of breaking, yet finding beauty in the fracture. The high notes soared but quivered. The low notes trembled with gravity. Each performance was less about technical perfection than about the raw spectacle of endurance. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, once reflected that Judy seemed most alive when singing, as if her body could vanish but her voice would remain. That idea took on eerie resonance. Her body would one day fail in London, but the recordings of her voice still linger, hauntingly present, untouched by death. The tragedy lies in the double bind. The very gift that made Judy immortal also chained her to a stage she could never leave. Audiences would always demand the voice, no matter the cost. To deliver it, Judy bled herself night after night. The sound-filled halls broke hearts, inspired generations, but it also hollowed her, until only the voice seemed real, and the woman behind it grew faint. When she sang, "The Man That Got Away," or "Over the Rainbow," the words seemed less like lyrics than prophecy. Each performance etched deeper into her story, reminding the world that Judy Garland's voice was not merely heard, it was endured. Endured until it shattered her. Judy Garland's life was a constant search for shelter, and too often she mistook love for safety. From her teenage years, she had been taught that her worth resided in performance, her value measured in applause and profit. Away from the stage, she yearned for something simpler, a home, a hand to hold, a place where she could lay down the weight of being Judy Garland. But each time she thought she had found it, love revealed itself as another kind of stage one where the scripts were cruel and the exits uncertain. Her first marriage, to band leader David Rose, was painted by the press as a fairy tale, but in truth it was short-lived, marked by indifference more than intimacy. Hollywood itself seemed to arrange the union, as though love could be scheduled between filming dates. The studio disapproved when Judy became pregnant, fearing scandal and derailed projects. The pregnancy was quietly terminated. It was one of many ways Judy was denied her own choices, even in her most private moments. Then came Vincente Minnelli, the director who seemed to see in her both muse and woman. Their marriage brought Liza into the world, a child Judy adored with ferocious tenderness. For a time, the family appeared golden mother, father, child framed in magazine spreads. But behind the glossy photos, fissures widened. Vincente's affairs, whispered rumors about his private life, and Judy's mounting dependency on pills strained the union until it fractured. Divorce arrived like a storm, leaving Judy adrift once more. Her third husband, Sid Luft, offered something different, a man who understood her fragility, yet pushed her relentlessly onto stages to keep the money flowing. He became her manager, her partner, and for a time her anchor. Together they produced 2 children, Lorna and Joey. Sid also engineered one of her greatest comebacks. A Star is Born in 1954, a film whose rawness mirrored Judy's own battles. But Luft was also controlling, sometimes violent, and Judy's trust eroded into fear. The Refuge became a cage. Later, marriages grew more volatile, more desperate. Mark Herron, her fourth husband, was rumored to be abusive. By the time she married Mickey Deans, her final husband, Judy was fragile, debt-ridden, and fighting the clock of her own body. Deans presented himself as a savior, the man who would protect her from ruin. Instead, he became the one to find her body lifeless in London. Each marriage carried the same motif, the promise of rescue, the illusion of stability, the collapse into betrayal or control. Love, for Judy, was always entangled with dependency. She wanted protection but often found exploitation. She wanted tenderness but encountered volatility. It was as though the very men she turned to for refuge mirrored the machinery of Hollywood, demanding, consuming, discarding. There is something haunting in the pattern. Each time she collapsed, she sought love as if it might undo the machinery that consumed her. But love, like fame, came with contracts unwritten. Those who drew close to her basked in her brilliance, but few knew how to shelter her from the storms that brilliance summoned. Her diaries, fragments of letters, and the recollections of friends reveal a woman caught between hope and resignation. She would write of loneliness in one line, then of dizzying devotion in the next. "If only someone could love me enough," she once confided, "I might stop running." Yet the running never ceased. The symbol of the wedding ring recurs throughout her story. Photographs capture her hand adorned, then bare, then adorned again. Rings slipped on, promises whispered, then rings removed, left behind in drawers or pawned to settle debts. They became less symbols of love than tokens of cycles hope ignited, hope betrayed. Psychologists speak of the human need for attachment, the way we seek out others to soothe the fractures within. Judy's attachments were like flares in the night sky, bright, brief, then swallowed by darkness. The danger was not that she loved too little, but that she loved with a hunger that few could sustain. And so, love became another stage in Judy Garland's long performance. The roles changed: husband, partner, savior, but the script remained the same. Promises spoken under chandeliers, broken in silence. What lingered each time was Judy herself, the woman who had given her heart as fiercely as she gave her voice, and who found that neither stage nor marriage could protect her from the shadows closing in. By the late 1952nd and into the 1962nd, Judy Garland's career had become less a steady climb and more a series of desperate resurrections. Each performance was announced as a comeback, as though she were forever returning from the brink. Audiences flocked not only to hear her sing, but to witness the drama of survival itself, the spectacle of a woman battling her own undoing under the heat of the spotlight. Her concerts during these years carried a peculiar tension. When she stepped on stage, dressed in sequins that caught the light like broken glass, there was always the question, would she make it through? Sometimes she was late. Sometimes she faltered. Sometimes her voice cracked. But when she endured, when the notes rose in defiance of expectation, the triumph felt transcendent. People wept in their seats, clutching each other, convinced they had seen something both miraculous and fragile. Carnegie Hall, April 1961, became the apotheosis of this paradox. Judy, then 39, delivered what critics later hailed as the greatest night in show business history. Her voice, raw yet commanding, filled the hall like a cathedral organ, every phrase charged with history and hurt. The recording of that concert would win 4 Grammys and secure her place in eternity. Yet the performance was less a testament to stability than to the extraordinary force of a woman who could pull glory from chaos. But for every night, like Carnegie Hall, there were others steeped in collapse. In London, in New York, in smaller theaters scattered across Europe, she sometimes staggered onto stage hours late, sometimes too weak to finish, sometimes booed by crowds who had come expecting the miracle and found only exhaustion. The applause that had once lifted her now turned to jeers when she failed to deliver. Fame, so intoxicating in its adoration, revealed its cruelty when patience wore thin. There is a haunting symbolism in the spotlight itself. It illuminated her, yes, but it also exposed every tremor, every falter, every bead of sweat. Under its glow, she could no longer hide. Her vulnerabilities became performance, her exhaustion woven into the music. The spotlight was both halo and interrogation lamp, conferring grace while stripping her bare. The stage became a battleground between Judy and her own body. Pills steadied her, betrayed her, numbed her, revived her. Her heart raced, her hands shook, her memory slipped. Yet, time and again, when the orchestra swelled, she drew herself upright, a defiant figure against the void. The sheer will of her presence could silence a restless audience, if only for a song. Friends described the aftermath as almost ritualistic. After each show, she would retreat backstage, her face pale beneath the rouge, her body trembling as though she had fought a war. The adoration of thousands evaporated into the quiet of a dressing room, where only mirrors and pill bottles remained. Applause did not follow her there. It never did. Philosophically, her concerts embodied the fragility of human endurance. They were not simply entertainment, but enactments of survival art, as both confession and combat. The audience did not come to see perfection. They came to see struggle transformed into beauty, pain alchemized into song. But this bargain was unsustainable. The more she gave, the less of her remained. One night in Melbourne, she collapsed mid-performance, her body finally refusing the demands of myth. Another evening, she simply walked off stage, unable to return. Each stumble, each missed note, was splashed across newspapers as evidence of decline. Yet the mystery lingered. How could someone so visibly diminished still produce moments of breathtaking brilliance? The answer, perhaps, lies in the paradox of Judy Garland herself. Her greatest art came not despite her suffering, but through it. The collapse on stage was not merely failure, it was revelation. She revealed what most performers conceal, that to live in the spotlight is to be consumed by it, piece by piece, until only fragments remain, and still, audiences returned. Because in those fragments, they saw themselves their own heartbreaks, their own resilience, their own longing for survival. Judy Garland had become more than an entertainer. She was a living parable of fragility and endurance, collapsing and rising, until the cycle itself became her legacy. By the summer of 1969, Judy Garland was living in a strange twilight of fame, still beloved, still recognized, yet diminished, like a once blazing star seen dimly through fog. She had moved to London earlier that year, a city where she had often been both celebrated and pitied. Now, at 47, she was broke, in frail health, and once again reinventing herself in a string of small venues and late-night cabaret shows. The house she rented with her fifth husband, Mickey Deans, was modest compared to the grandeur she had once known. At 4 Cadogan Lane, the rooms were narrow, the wallpaper faded, the neighborhood respectable but not glamorous. It was not the palace of a Hollywood legend, but the quiet quarters of a woman trying to outrun her debts, her demons, and her past. The neighbors saw her come and go, often smiling, sometimes frail, always watched. In these final weeks, contradictions abounded. Judy had just married Deans a few months earlier, in March, in a small ceremony in London. She seemed determined to believe in a new chapter, telling friends that at last she had found stability. Yet others whispered doubts about Deans, a nightclub manager decades younger, who seemed more opportunist than savior. He hovered between caretaker and enabler, arranging her bookings, managing her appearances, and guarding her against creditors. To some, he appeared devoted, to others, calculated. Her concerts in London that spring revealed the same fragile brilliance of her later years. At Talk of the Town, a nightclub in Leicester Square, Judy performed before packed houses. The audience adored her. But the reviews were mixed, her voice faltered, her timing wavered, yet her presence, her sheer aura, still captivated. For every critic who dismissed her as a fallen star, there were hundreds of fans who rose to their feet, desperate to be part of her survival. But behind the applause, there was exhaustion. Friends reported that Judy seemed restless, unsteady, always tired. She was thin, her body worn by decades of stimulants, diets, and insomnia. The cycle of pills continued, as much ritual as necessity. At times, she was radiant, witty, sparkling at parties. At other times, she drifted into shadows, her eyes heavy, her sentences incomplete. Financial ruin shadowed her every move. Decades of mismanagement, lawsuits, and unpaid taxes had left her with little security. She borrowed, begged, sometimes performed for meager sums just to stay afloat. For a woman once hailed as one of Hollywood's brightest jewels, the contrast was brutal. The newspapers called it tragic. Judy herself joked about it, turning humiliation into humor, though beneath the laughter was bitterness. London itself seemed to mirror her state. Gray skies, intermittent rain, a city shifting uneasily between past grandeur and modern uncertainty. Judy wandered its streets like a figure out of place, clutching coats against the drizzle, slipping into taxis, ducking into nightclubs. In photographs from that spring, she is smiling but drawn, her hair loosely styled, her clothes often mismatched. She looked less like a star and more like an ordinary woman who had once carried the weight of myth. There is something eerie about her proximity to the end. She seemed both alive and already spectral, her presence flickering between vitality and disappearance. She spoke of new plans, tours, films, even recording again. Yet those who knew her well sensed a closing chapter. She was exhausted, one friend said. She had given everything, and there was nothing left to give. The symbol of the curtain looms large in this period. For decades, Judy had lived behind curtains, velvet ones in theaters, gauzy ones in hotel rooms, the drawn curtains of limousines and dressing rooms. In June 1969, the curtains of her London townhouse were often half closed, shading her from curious eyes. Behind them, she drifted between fragile hope and inevitable decline. On the evening of the 21st of June, Judy and Mickey attended a dinner party. Friends recalled her smiling, though tired, a woman both buoyed and broken by her own legend. When they returned to Cadogan Lane, rain pattered against the windows, a sound that seemed almost funereal. It would be her last night. Morning crept quietly over Belgravia on the 22nd of June, 1969. Behind the cream-painted facade of 4 Cadogan Lane, the silence was unbroken until Mickey Deans pushed open the bathroom door. What he found there would etch itself into history. Judy Garland, collapsed on the tiled floor, her body still, her bare feet pale against the cold stone. She was only 47. The scene was deceptively ordinary. No dramatic tableau, no farewell note, just the stark quiet of a woman undone in a rented townhouse. The police report listed an incautious self-overdose of barbiturates, her body unable to withstand the cumulative weight of years of dependence. The coroner insisted there was no evidence of suicide. Yet for those who had watched her life unfold, the explanation felt too thin, too neat, too final. The contradictions multiplied. Judy had been animated the night before, dining with friends, speaking of future projects. She had just remarried months earlier, had spoken of fresh beginnings. Yet her body was frail, her spirit uneven, her health fragile beyond repair. Was it a tragic accident? A subconscious surrender? Or the inevitable end to a life relentlessly accelerated by others? London awoke to the news with a hush, and soon the world followed. Newspapers spilled across doorsteps, with headlines mourning the girl who never grew up, the tragic star, the lost Dorothy. Strangers wept in train stations. Fans gathered outside Cadogan Lane. Reporters shouted questions that no one could answer. Even in death, Judy Garland was spectacle, her private undoing made public once more. Her autopsy revealed a body worn thin by decades of strain. Cirrhosis beginning, malnutrition evident, lungs scarred by cigarettes, veins weary from chemicals. She had been living, in essence, on borrowed time. Yet the report, with all its cold medical facts, could not capture the enormity of what had been lost, the voice, the presence, the strange alchemy that turned suffering into art. In Belgravia, the bathroom tiles became a kind of final stage, a cruel parody of the spotlight. There, without audience, without orchestra, Judy Garland's story reached its last act. The curtain had fallen not with applause, but with silence. Her funeral in New York drew tens of thousands. Fans lined the streets outside Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel, the same place that had seen the farewells of Caruso, Valentino, and Monroe. They pressed flowers against the glass, sang softly in unison somewhere over the rainbow. It was not just mourning. It was a collective confession of complicity. They had adored her brilliance, consumed her fragility, demanded her return again and again, until there was nothing left to return. There is a haunting symmetry in how her body was placed to rest beneath the earth, while her voice remained forever in the air. Recordings still soared, films still flickered, concerts still lived on in memory. Judy Garland was gone, but she was not gone. Like Dorothy herself, she had sought home all her life, but her final home was not one she could walk toward. It was one carved by absence, by memory, by longing. The motif of the rainbow returns here, as it must. The song that had crowned her as a teenager, The song she sang until her last years became her epitaph. For many, it remains impossible to hear "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" without sensing the ache of her life, her yearning for a place beyond pain, beyond performance, beyond the reach of studios, critics, and lovers who all demanded pieces of her. In Belgravia, the body was removed quietly. The street soon emptied. Yet the image remains. Judy Garland, silenced in a narrow townhouse far from Hollywood, her story unresolved. For in every retelling, the mystery endures not merely how she died, but how she lived, how she carried brilliance and despair in equal measure, how she became both miracle and casualty, how she was consumed by the very light she cast. Judy Garland's death was not an end, but a question about fame, about love, about the cost of turning a human being into a legend, a question that still lingers like the echo of her voice, trembling, breaking, yet soaring forever, reaching for a rainbow just out of reach.